The great leader shall stay abreast of public sentiment and shall find ways to shape it so as to align public sentiment with his own vision. And the president who was best at this was Abraham Lincoln. I saved the best for last, our greatest president. And Abe Lincoln once said, public sentiment is everything. Whoever molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces judicial decisions. Because Lincoln is such an important president, I have two different historians who I interviewed on him. The first, Harold Holzer, probably our most esteemed Lincoln scholar, who won the Lincoln Prize last year. He's written over a dozen books on Lincoln. And Ronald White, who's written 3 books on Lincoln. The one, A. Lincoln, I think is the best cradle-to-grave biography of Lincoln. New York Times bestseller, came out in 2009, the Lincoln bicentennial year. And to understand, okay, how did he understand public sentiment and how did he shape it to align with his vision? They said that, how do you understand public sentiment in the 1860s and 50s? It was all about knowing what the people who ran the local newspapers knew. So wherever Lincoln would travel, whether legal business or political business, he always made a point of stopping at the local newspaper office, talking to the publisher and the editor and the reporters, and finding out the talk of their town so he could be able to know what he needed to shape, what exactly was the basis for the public sentiment. And then once he knew what the sentiment was, they said that particularly upon becoming president, he shaped it by writing newspaper editorials, giving tightly eloquent speeches, by strategically leaking information to the media, and by writing a letter to the editor of one major paper that he would distribute nationally so that it would go viral. So here's an example of Lincoln understanding the public sentiment and finding a way to shape it to align with his vision over the crucial issue of slavery during the Civil War. Now, obviously, slavery was a huge issue, and in September of 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary version of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was aimed at freeing those slaves who had escaped from their southern owners and allowing them to become emancipated and ultimately to participate in support of the Union Army during the Civil War. Now, and then the final version was signed on January 1, 1863. Now, I don't know how many of you have read the Emancipation Proclamation. You hear the word emancipation, slavery, you probably assume that somewhere in there is some mention of the immorality of slavery, about how inherently unfair it is for people to be slaves on the basis solely of their color, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, there is nothing about that in the Emancipation Proclamation. And the reason was because Lincoln knew public sentiment. He knew that there were many in the North and more than many in the border states who had not figured out what they thought about slavery. Should we end it now? Should we end it in a few years? They hadn't made up their minds. And so if Lincoln had made this big moral pronouncement about the evils of slavery, there would have been a lot of pushback. But Lincoln knew what the public sentiment really was in 1862 and 1863 was everyone was sick and tired of the Civil War and all these people who were being killed and wounded and the country disrupted. And what people wanted more than anything was for a commander-in-chief who could find a way to bring the war to an end sooner rather than later. So he said, the reason I'm issuing this Emancipation Proclamation is for one reason: military necessity. And they said, that's okay with us. You're the commander-in-chief. If you think we need to do this to make our cause stronger, to win this war quicker, we're all for you. And there was very little pushback on the Emancipation Proclamation. Of course, it led to the 13th Amendment, which was the subject of the Steven Spielberg film.